I'm Tiffany Barnes, an assistant professor from the Department of Political Science at the University of Kentucky, and I won the Breckinridge Award for the best paper presented on women in politics at the previous MPSA conference. So that paper was on support for legislative gender quotas. So gender quotas they're a type of electoral law that are adopted to increase women's numeric representation in legislative bodies. And they've been widely adopted across Latin America. So as of today, all but 2 countries in Latin America have adopted a legislative gender quota. And when designed and implemented properly, they're really effective at increasing women's access to office. But prior to this research, we haven't really had a good understanding of how well they're accepted by the public. So this is really important because if legislative gender quotas are adopted and implemented to increase women's numeric representation, but the public doesn't like this policy, then it can undermine support for elected officials and effectively erode democratic legitimacy. This paper focused on public support for legislative gender quotas to understand who in the public's more likely to support quotas and under what conditions. And so we focused on some individual level factors such as people's ideas about the role of government intervention and ideas about women's roles in society as well. But then we perhaps most importantly find that there's some really important systematic factors that can help build support for legislative policies such as gender quotas. So in particular, we find that when the state's functioning well and is really good at implementing policies, then it can create buy-in and public support for these sorts of policies, regardless of citizens' kind of underlying views about gender equality and the role of the state. So the bulk of my research focuses on when marginalized groups in society gain access to representation. And so we can think about this from a number of different perspectives, right? So we can think about them actually gaining elected positions in office, so gaining access through descriptive representation. But then we can also think about them gaining access to representation through being able to influence the policymaking process. And so what research has shown is that just because people are elected to office doesn't mean that they always have influence over the policymaking process. And so some of my most recent work focuses on how marginalized groups navigate institutions once they're elected in order to influence the policymaking process. And so in particular, I focus on women in Latin America. And I find that in my research, once women gain access, they don't typically have, or once they're elected to office, they don't typically have access to the most powerful leadership positions or most important committee posts. So this limits their ability to influence the policymaking process. And as a result, women have to work within these institutions and use kind of other informal mechanisms to influence the policymaking process. And so in particular, I find that women are much more collaborative in the policymaking process than are men. So women are more likely to network and collaborate, work on developing legislation, both with other women within their own party, but also they're far more likely to cross party lines to work on developing legislation. And this is really important because it allows them to have more influence in the policymaking process. So as opposed to just influencing the up or down vote at the end of the policymaking process, they're able to exert their preferences and influence the development of legislation. And in addition to this, it allows them to create potentially more effective legislation, right? So oftentimes, especially with marginalized groups, what we'll find is that it's very difficult to design effective legislation because issues that pertain to them or disproportionately affect the lives of women or other marginalized groups oftentimes haven't been a big salient part of the legislative agenda. And so it takes a long time before we get the policymaking process right. And so if more policymakers are involved in bringing to bear different perspectives and different ideas on the policymaking process, then they can develop more effective policies from the onset. So it's a little bit of an unexpected finding, I guess you would say, because despite that women still have limited access to formal institutions of decision-making authority within institutions, they're able to navigate around those and circumvent those limitations to be influential and effective policymakers. I feel like I've been really privileged to have a lot of support for my research, and in particular with my book project, it's now I say book project, my book manuscript at Cambridge University Press. I had really generous support from the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, was able to go and spend a semester there on a fellowship writing, and then also had funding from the National Science Foundation, which made my work, much better than it would have been without the support. And more recently, I received the Carrie Chapman Cap Prize that's allowed me to start a new project, and then also some funding from the University of Kentucky from the Office for Policy Studies on Violence Against Women. So I just wanted to acknowledge the support that I've received from those different institutions. One question that you asked me before coming here was, who's the most influential person on your research or for your career? And I started thinking about it, and I just have a really difficult time kind of pinpointing one person, as I'm sure many people do, but I feel like a large part of my success is due to kind of the bigger network and group of women that I've been involved with. And so part of that's through the Women's Caucus, part of that's through the kind of research network with the women who focus on gender and politics and the way that they collaborate with one another and work with one another and support one another. And then also I'm involved in a writing group. And so in particular, two of my really good friends and mentors, Maria Holman and Erin Kitsis, started a writing group, and we interact with each other probably on a daily basis almost, and exchange bits of research at the end of every week and give each other feedback. And these different networks, the writing group, the Women's Caucus, just the network of support that I've built within my research subfield have all just been so instrumental in so many ways, both in professionalizing me and helping me learn how to navigate the discipline and how to be successful. They've been incredibly instrumental in helping me become a better writer, a better scholar, and then just really formative in terms of how I think about representation, how I think about women's access to political power, and they've really influenced me both intellectually and professionally. And so I just think I'm really privileged to be a part of these different networks and to have some really incredible, influential women in my life that have allowed me to take full advantage of my career and to really, develop into a more successful scholar. So I certainly could not imagine still being in the discipline without them. I don't think I would have survived. I probably would have left a long time ago, but also it's just allowed me to be much more successful. So yeah, so I think I would say the networks of women in my life are the most influential in terms of for my career. And the way I think about my job and what I do with my research is that I'm a data scientist, and I work to develop logical arguments and test those with empirical evidence, right? And recently I feel like we've seen a move away from a desire for evidence-based policies and a desire for evidence-based outcomes. And so I think as political scientists, we have many important roles. One is finding evidence and using that information to make it available to policymakers so that they can make evidence-based policies. But also now more than ever, I feel like my role in the classroom is really important because I really want for my students to be able to critically evaluate arguments and critically evaluate evidence so that they can make informed decisions themselves, right? So, I don't see it as my role to influence my students' ideologies or how they think, but to encourage them to think, because I think we've seen so much of a movement away from that. And to think critically and to question, even their own beliefs, but to demand evidence for policies that are being made, right? I've actually spent some time in both of my classes this semester talking about fake news and how to go about discerning what's good news and what's reliable news, and I didn't ever think that was a conversation that I would be having with my class, I'm not that old, but I've watched the development of this kind of alternative facts and fake news come up even since I've been teaching, right? And I don't know, it's a big challenge because we have so much evidence and information that says that people want to seek out information that reinforces their beliefs And even when they're presented with evidence, they discard or discount evidence that isn't consistent with their beliefs, right? So there's an entire body of political science research that shows us this kind of very robust finding. And even informed, otherwise intelligent people do this, right? So we all engage in this confirmation bias. And it's a huge challenge, right? And so I think the biggest thing is to make people aware that they do that, because just like with other sorts of biases, just like sexism and racism, if we refuse to acknowledge that we're sexist and that we're racist, then we can't change how we behave, right? And so if we refuse to acknowledge that we're all ideologues and want information that reinforces our own beliefs, then we can't be, if we're not aware of that, then we can't critically evaluate, the information we're taking in.